I'm Chris Stafford, and this is AART, the podcast where we get to know the women behind their art.
If you don't feel it, I'll make you feel it. I'll show you what I mean. If you don't feel it, I'll make you feel it. I'll bring you to your knees. If you follow me.
My guest this week is movie poster, illustrator, and designer Akiko Stehrenberger. Akiko was born in South Lake Tahoe, California in 1978. A first-generation American, she is the second youngest of 4 children, with 1 sister and 2 brothers. Akiko's father, designer Mark Stehrenberger, is Swiss-German, and her mother, Aiko from Taiwan, which until she was 8 years old was under Japanese rule. And they met when they emigrated to Los Angeles in the 60s. Akiko's mother spoke both Japanese and Mandarin, but fostered more of a Japanese culture. Although she was not a professional artist, she encouraged Akiko to take up drawing and apply for art school, that being the preferred option to her enlisting for the army, which came close to being a reality. And so, in 1997, Akiko began studying illustration and design at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California. She also worked a variety of jobs to get through college and after she graduated, in order to pursue her career and pay off student loans. New York beckoned, and she moved from Southern California to learn the trades of becoming a designer and illustrator. When her mother became ill, Akiko moved back to LA. It was also, coincidentally, at the time when magazines were moving online, that she fell into the movie poster industry, which changed the course of her life. In 2004, she officially began her career as a movie poster artist. It would be the film Funny Games, for which her poster was chosen, that put creative directors and the film industry on notice that here was an artist making her mark. Akiko is now a 23-time Clio Award winner who was deemed the poster girl by Interview magazine. Vanity Fair included her Funny Games and Kiss of the Damned posters in their best movie posters of all time list. Her Der Five Bloods is on view at the Academy Motion Pictures Museum. Akiko's portfolio includes Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Tar, Dune, Beef, and Everything Everywhere All at Once, to name just a few. Akiko combines traditional illustration techniques and modern graphic design to create textural elements with fearless experimentation, showcasing her crafty intuition and versatility by capturing the essence of a film in a single image. New Life director John Rossman said, "Akiko is simply one of the best poster artists of all time." Her first book, Akiko-matic, The Works of Akiko Stehrenberger, published in 2020, will be updated with more recent posters later this year for its 2nd edition. Akiko lives in Los Angeles with her son Barrington. Akiko, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Of course. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Well, you know I'm a big fan of your work, and I just told you that I start my day looking for your Instagram stories because they're hilarious. I'd imagine it does loads for your algorithms, though, doesn't it? I mean, you must have a following just for your stories.
I believe so. You know, hey, I'll take whatever I can get at this point. But yeah, if I can make people laugh, that's great for me.
Are you considered to be the one that, tells the jokes in a party?
Yes. I mean, I'm usually more of an introvert at parties, but the people close to me, they definitely see a really goofy side of me, almost too much. Yeah, anybody close to me wouldn't be surprised by some of the memes that I post.
It's not surprising that you have the sense of humor that you do, because you just find an angle, and it's just different every time. I'm always impressed with your versatility and how, you do bring humor. You do bring so many different aspects into that piece. And I want to talk later about how you do that, because each piece is obviously unique. But you do have a style. And I know you had mentioned to me how you do have someone who was a role model in Nancy Phelps, who influenced you. And looking at her work, I can see just how much that influenced you.
Definitely. I mean, I always appreciated her sense of humor and her way of kind of making these images that were a hybrid of something that you already know and putting a different twist on it. So her work and Javier Jaén, I believe he's from Spain, like they both have this kind of a sensibility that when I discovered them, I was like, oh, there are people that share the same interests as me. And I definitely was so inspired by their work and so happy I found them.
Did you, as a child, look at comics and, comical storylines? And is that where the humor and the illustrations all came together, do you think, in your early days? Definitely.
I mean, Mad Magazine especially was a huge influence on me. And I didn't realize that until much later on in my life. My dad would come to Los Angeles quite often and come and go to bookstores and look at automobile magazines. And I would be off in the corner looking at Mad magazines, especially for the last page, the fold-ins. But in addition to that, just seeing these covers and how amazing they were illustrated and Alfred and Newman and depicted in such clever ways that would touch on current events and pop culture. So, I mean, that definitely, without me knowing it, entered my brain and stayed with me. And not just for the covers, but inside stories and all the illustrations involved. They were just so clever and somewhat crass, but I always admired them.
Did you keep a scrapbook?
Did I keep a scrapbook? No, but I do have a huge collection of Mad magazines in my office right now. And when one of my best friends moved away, he let me adopt a good collection of his too. So Mad Magazine, I believe, and The Far Side, I would have to say that those are very strong, strong front runners of what I grew up with. My dad also, still to this day, has an amazing sense of humor. So humor was definitely always part of our everyday.
And, with those early influences then, I'm just wondering how, you bringing together the humor. Did you start to, plot out things with a pencil? Were you sketching then as a child and trying to come up with ideas outside the box?
I don't know if I was necessarily into conceptual work at that time. I think that came later on. It was more about practicing skill and making something look like what I was trying to draw. But I remember I always drew. I mean, I grew up seeing my dad hunched over his drafting table. So I was lucky to have that as an early influence. And in addition, my mom was always interested in crafts and learning new skills. And even though she never took that to a professional level, I mean, she was a mother of four. I definitely was influenced from both my parents, and I feel so lucky that art was such a prevalent thing in our family.
It was your mum's idea that you should try drawing.
It was. I mean, I think she was just more afraid of me joining the army than anything because, I would say that I was a good student, but when it came to finding a focus and trying to figure out what I wanted to do after high school, I didn't really feel like anything struck a chord with me. I mean, I knew that I always drew, and I knew that amongst my friends, I would always be making drawings for them, but I didn't really think that I would take it on as a career. And I think during that kind of middle ground of trying to figure out what to do after high school, I did speak with an Army recruiter. And I thought maybe it'd be a good idea to join their graphic design program. But I think that scared the living crap out of my mom. And at that point, she figured the lesser of the two evils would be trying to do an art thing and go to art school.
She preferred to think of you with a pencil rather than a gun.
Exactly. And I always joke that I always wonder what my life, how differently it would have been if I had gone the other direction.
How far did that thought go then?
Yes, I was actually one step away from swearing in. So I met with them a few times. And I remember in high school having a boyfriend that was in the Navy, and he had great things to say about the military. So I just figured that would be a good way to get out of town and figure out the rest of my life. But yeah, my mother thought that maybe drawing might be a better option for me.
Far less risk involved. I think that was probably a good move on her part.
I mean, depends on how you see it. No, I'm just kidding. But no, it's definitely true. And I think as I mentioned in our earlier conversation, I was really lucky because I'm first generation American. And especially having an Asian mom, not many Asian parents, especially during that time, encourage art. And so I feel really, really lucky that she really pushed for it.
So let's go back to those beginnings. You were born in South Lake Tahoe. Your father Swiss and your mother from Taiwan, and that was an interesting background about her Mandarin culture and the background that she brought to that marriage before your parents met over here. Talk a little bit about that and those early influences, Akiko.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, my mother was born in Taiwan when it was under Japanese occupation. And I believe when she was about 8 or 9, the Chinese took over Taiwan. So she always would say that she was born a Japanese, grew up as a Chinese, and then later on when she was about to pass away, she said she was going to die as an American. So she was actually 3 cultures in one woman. But because she was born under the Japanese occupation, she was actually born as Akiko. And it wasn't until later that she was renamed a Chinese name. And even though the Chinese culture took over, she always had high regard for Japanese art, Japanese influence. And even when we were little, she would dress us up in kimonos, and she gave me and she gave my siblings Japanese names. And as you can imagine, that's extremely confusing, especially with our Swiss German last name.
Yeah.
But yeah, anytime she would cook Asian food in the home, it would be Japanese. So there was always just a big kind of mixing pot of cultures growing up.
Did she teach you any Mandarin?
She didn't, because unfortunately, when my little brother and I were born, we were born in Northern California, and at that time, she was experiencing a lot of racism to the point where they wouldn't even allow her to give birth to us in a hospital. So she birthed both my little brother and I at home on her bed. And I think during that time, because of that, she and my father really wanted to focus on raising us as Americans. So it's interesting to see, people of mixed cultures, not even a full generation behind me, even a half generation, how they were taught their parents' languages. But I think just because of where we grew up at that time, and because of my father and mother speaking English to each other, they just focused on the American side.
What brought her to the States initially, Akiko?
I think, both of them had this big American dream. I believe she was always interested in the world and interested in people that weren't like her. And when she came to the States, it was in the 60s. And as far as my father concerns, he really wanted to be in the arts, and he really wanted to be in design. And growing up in a small town in Switzerland, his father was a roofer, and he wanted to do more than roofing. So I feel like they were both seeking out a different life. And when they both immigrated from either of their countries, they came to Los Angeles, and that's where they met.
What did she do for a living?
She was a mother of four. She actually became a single mother of four, due to their divorce and my dad starting other families, pretty early on in my life. So unfortunately, that didn't give her, much time to have a career. She had jobs to support us, but, her studies back in Taiwan, she studied to be a mechanical engineer. And, despite being so engineer minded, she always had interest in something a little bit more off the wall. I mean, obviously she married my dad, who's like one of the most silly off the wall people you'll ever meet. But there was definitely a thirst for creativity. And so when she was given some time to herself, she would take a lot of creative courses at city colleges, anywhere from ceramics to stage makeup and even she would make a lot of our clothes. So there was always a very prominent creative bug in her. And any time that she could, she would use it. Even when it came to our Halloween costumes, she really would go above and beyond. So I think those became her outlets.
Did any of that rub off on you?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Now that my son is 6 years old, I made his costume last year and I helped make something for his school Halloween fair. And I definitely want to pass on that excitement for that holiday as my mom passed it on to me.
So what was your early childhood like? As you mentioned, you have one sister and two brothers. You're the second youngest.
I do.
What was early childhood like? What were your fond memories growing up?
My little brother and I, we were born in South Lake Tahoe on the California side. And then once my parents separated and eventually got divorced, we spent the majority of our childhood moving around and making our way to Southern California. As far as fond memories, I was definitely closer to my two brothers than I was my sister. And, I was a rough and tumble sister and, wore all my brother's clothes because I'm number 3 in the lineup. So, but yeah, it was an interesting childhood and being raised in so many cultures was not only confusing, but it also made me who I am. After my parents separated, my dad got remarried 2 more times after that. So it was always kind of adopting of a new culture and new things. So we always joked about how our family getting together became looks like a McDonald's commercial, because I have cousins that are half Chinese, half Bulgarian, or half Mexican, half Swiss, and we're all first generation Americans, but boy, did our parents want to mix and mingle. So, it was, I didn't realize how special that was until I met more and more people.
Did you get to learn Swiss German along the way?
I didn't get to learn Swiss German along the way, which I'm sad about, because I remember growing up that was an unwritten language at the time. And, I would have, I did actually visit Switzerland quite often because my dad lived there for a good portion of my childhood and a lot of his family was still over there. Whereas my mother's family, when she came to America, she sponsored all her siblings to come to Los Angeles. So, I actually didn't get to visit Taiwan until very, very much later in my life. But, most of my relatives from her side are in America.
And what were your impressions? What age were you when you went to Taiwan?
Oh, gosh, I feel like that was probably 10 years ago. So I was a full-blown adult at that point. I didn't have any immediate family that was there. So my mother was she was religious, so she was there on a mission. So when she was there, that's when I decided to visit her. And it was such an amazing thing to see where she grew up and to really feel this connection to this country. That was kind of a mystery to me most of my life. In Asian culture, especially my mom's generation, you tend to find out more about their life after they have passed away. So it was only later on that I found out more about how she was born, how she was raised, and just little things that I thought were quirks of my mom, but were actually like heavily cultural as well. And so, it was like a slow opening of like a treasure chest. And I know it sounds cliche, but as soon as I was in Taiwan, I definitely felt the connection there. And I actually saw a lot of Japanese influence still there. So it all sort of made sense of why my mom always had this pull towards the Japanese culture.
How did their divorce impact you, Akiko?
You know what? It definitely impacted my little brother and myself much less than my older siblings. I think because we grew up never seeing them hold hands or sitting at a dinner table together, and my father was gone a lot of the time. I mean, even when they were married, he spent at least half of the year in Switzerland. So there wasn't witnessing a deterioration. Deterioration was already there. And I think by the time they announced that they were no longer going to be married, my little brother and I were actually relieved, whereas my older siblings, they had a system that slowly broke down in front of them, and that was more heartbreaking for them.
Mm-hmm. And how did you spend your out of school time when you were a child? Did you go to movie theaters a lot? I have to ask that.
You know what? We didn't go to the theater very often. I was definitely more of a very shy child. And because we moved around quite a bit, and it always takes me a little bit of time to open up to someone, I felt like every time I finally opened up and made friends, we were moving again. So it was kind of this attaching and detaching that consistently happened when I was a child. But as far as like seeing movies, I mean, there was definitely a small theater where we grew up, but like it wasn't like an event to go see movies. I remember my father being obsessed with James Bond movies. So if I think of like my earliest memories of film and movies, like James Bond was definitely something that was like more consistent in my home. Indiana Jones, and so I had kind of those as like my first core memories of movies.
Now, were you a very girly girl when you were a child, or a bit of a tomboy?
I was definitely more of like one of my brothers, and even my boyfriend to this day, the first time he saw me with my nephews and nieces, he's like, you know what? You're not an aunt. You're an uncle. So I mean, I because I grew up with brothers, I always like somehow related more to the more masculine side of things. And then a lot of my friends tend to be guys, and I somehow always find a way to shock even them. So I was definitely more of a tomboy. Maybe that also explains my sense of humor.
Possibly. What were your subjects at school then? Was it art? Wait, what else did you enjoy?
I enjoyed art, and I also enjoyed math, which you would never think, given how I can't do any of it now these days. I blame it on the iPhone. But yeah, I loved math. Science definitely wasn't my strong point, but I also liked English composition and writing.
And was it an easy decision then to go to art college, which you did? You started in 1997?
I did. I mean, I put together a portfolio as soon as I graduated high school, and I applied at the Art Center, and they laughed in my face because they were looking for figure drawings, a more anatomically correct type of artwork. And here I was drawing cartoons, and because I went to high school in a high population of Latino, I had like Latino based artwork. Like I had lowrider cars and chola clowns, and they didn't really, like, the Art Center didn't really know what to do with it. They told me to come back in a few years when I had done some more figure drawings. And so what I did at that point on, I had 3 jobs, and I also took a night class where all I did was figure drawings. And the next term I applied and I got accepted.
And what were the jobs that you took in the meantime?
Oh, in the meantime, I was working at a tanning salon. I was working at a frozen yogurt shop. I'm trying to think where else I was working, but I always had multiple jobs going on.
Well, this would have been helpful, I'd imagine. It colors your background.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I worked at many restaurants. I worked at grocery stores in high school, and so, my friends always make fun of me because when we get a meal at a restaurant, I'm practically bussing the table for us. And they're like, hey, that this is their job. And I'm like, yes, I'm just trying to make it easier for them, and I do see the difference of people who have worked in a restaurant versus not, and how they treat people, wait staff at a restaurant. And I always want to kind of make things a little bit easier for them. I know that if they have to deal with 20 assholes in one day, I want to be the one that's actually not one. So that's always how I come in at restaurants.
I would love to go to dinner sometime with you and maybe learn something.
Oh my gosh, if they let me, I'd walk the dishes to the back and start washing them for them.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, so off you went to college and doing what they wanted you to do. How was that experience, though? How did that shape you literally for what lied ahead? Because you didn't know at that point what your future was going to hold.
Yeah, I didn't have a plan in place. The Art Center is known for being a boot camp of art school. I think our rival school was Cal Arts, and I always heard about how they had crazy parties and clothing was optional, whereas our school was very regimented and very intense. And if you didn't do your homework the very first day of a new term, you were always going to be behind because they were jam-packed courses. We didn't have semesters. We had trimesters, and each trimester was 14 weeks. And because I was there on loans and scholarships, a lot of people stretched out their program so that they wouldn't be overpacked with classes. However, Art Center did this thing where they started raising the tuition every trimester. And I knew that I had to kind of do a very condensed and intensive course because I couldn't afford to do more terms. So I remember in one term, I was taking over 32 units. And so, every week I would pull at least one all-nighter trying to get everything done. But at that time I was young and I really wanted to be there and I really wanted to soak up everything. So, I was willing to do that. And that kind of set the precedent, that kind of set how I was going to be working for a very long time. I think I've always been a workhorse, and I've always taken on a lot of projects at once. And I don't know if I somehow get some sick, twisted, kick out of seeing how much I can pile on my plate, but it immediately set me up to work my butt off. And once I graduated college, I went to New York, and here I was working 3 jobs and also freelancing as an illustrator, and didn't sleep much, but the hard work was really ingrained in me. And I really feel like that is what got me to where I am today.
Yeah, I can imagine the discipline of it would have been a great foundation, because looking at your output now, I wonder how, I was going to ask this anyway, what how you choose, because it seems you are in great demand now.
I am, and I feel so lucky for that, definitely. Over the years, I've been more lucky to pick and choose the projects I work on. I think during the pandemic, I was in this mode where I was saying yes to everything because I was hearing about all the studios shutting down, and I was afraid that every project would be my last for a while. And at the time, my son's father, who was in music, all his work completely dried up. So I was really thankful that I was able to continue working during the pandemic. I mean, mind you, it was intense because, at that time, my son's dad and we split up. So my son was with me half of the week, and I had this schedule where I would be with my son. He was younger. He was like 2.5. So I couldn't just have him be in another room, where I was with him until 7:30 at night for his bedtime. And then at 7:30 at night, that's when I would start my work day and work until about 6 a.m. And then my son would wake up at 6:30 again. So I was on this crazy schedule, but there was also the fear of God in me that the work was going to dry up. And so I just kept it going until things slowly started opening up. But the one thing that worked in my favor is that even with movie productions shutting down, the streaming services were going crazy. And they, as you can tell, like every title of a film has like multiple pieces of art for it. Every time you scroll on Netflix, you see a new piece of art for the same title. So because of that, I had plenty of work, and I'm so thankful for that.
It doesn't seem as if it's going to dry up anytime soon. So that must give you great comfort, especially raising a child.
It gives me so much comfort, and now with the writer's strike and everything, I hear of other agencies kind of slowing down, but again, I'm busy. So I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful to be in the position that I am.
Well, going back to New York, your time there, you were 4 years there, and it was before and after 9/11.
It was.
And you have some very strong memories from that experience.
I do. At that time, I think I had about 4 roommates, and I was on the Lower East Side, and so I was less than a mile away from Ground Zero. And I had 2 friends visiting from Los Angeles that were celebrating their anniversary, and they wanted to have dinner on top of the World Trade Center that evening. And they decided that morning to walk down there and take a look at it. And that's when they saw the first building come down. And then shortly after, they saw the second building come down. So they ran up to my apartment, and they made an announcement to my roommates and I. And we were so confused about what was going on. I mean, it just wasn't even on our radar. I mean, we were in our early 20s, and during that time, none of us paid attention to politics. And so to all of a sudden have it be shoved in our faces, it was a really, really, it's like we were almost in shock. And instead of choosing to break down and freak out, we immediately did what a lot of New Yorkers did. We immediately lined up to go donate blood. And I can't tell you how amazing it was to walk down the street and just see lines and lines of people signing up to donate blood. I mean, they had to turn people away, but that was a different time, people's first instinct was to help. And I wish something like that would have happened during the pandemic. In fact, it was the opposite. But, to go back to that memory and see humanity and community trying to step forward to help others, it was quite an incredible experience. And it definitely, I take that away from that experience more than the scariness of the actual attacks.
Yeah, and the impact on New Yorkers, of course. In the aftermath of that, how were you kind of able to operate? Because things like that, like a pandemic, like a major catastrophe like that, really impact you to the very core, don't they? How was it for you in following days and weeks?
It was interesting. I mean, again, everybody was sort of in shock. And you wake up thinking it was a bad dream. But, a few days later, there was rain. And then before the rain, there was this huge gust of wind that blew up my street. And my street was the main access point for a lot of ambulances. So we would consistently hear sirens. But when that wind blew up our street, we woke up in the middle of the night with having to close our windows. And it was just the smell of burnt rubber and smoke and, dead bodies, and so any moment where you have like a lapse in thinking about it, you were constantly reminded, and there's just ash everywhere, and all throughout the city were just missing posters, so it was surreal. It was like being in a movie, and I think we were mode at that point, and I think everybody was just trying to maintain somewhat of a normal life. I know that Giuliani at that time was like, go back to work. Let's try to just like try to retain some normalcy. But it was very strange. It was like being in the Twilight Zone, Black Mirror, So I think everybody was just trying to maintain. And even though everybody was clearly traumatized.
At what point did you decide to leave New York then and move back to LA?
So at that time in 9/11, I was working at a restaurant. I was working for a photographer, and I was doing freelance in music and entertainment magazines. And the restaurant that I worked in was half a block down from a firehouse that lost 13 of their firemen. And we would see them daily because they would come down for coffee and sambuca every day. And so that was devastating. But despite how traumatizing that whole experience, that I wanted to stay in New York. Stayed in New York for maybe 3 years after that. And again, it was just grinding, working multiple jobs, but also at the same time showing my portfolio nonstop and being quite not aggressive about it, but very proactive about getting my work in front of people's faces. And when I first moved to New York, I had no idea how to do that. So I walked into a bookstore. I looked up every single magazine that I was interested in. I flipped open their front cover and saw who the art director was. And I mailed them promotion cards. I tried to get, I dropped off my portfolios to them. I tried to get meetings with them, and I was nonstop. And eventually somebody hired me, and then I got hired more and more. And I was starting to get pretty stable freelance work from it. But then 9/11 happened, and then everything kind of changed at that point. And I think over the years, more magazines went online. So the budgets were definitely being drastically cut. And I think after being there for 3 years post 9/11, my mother, she became sick with Hep C. And that's when I decided to move back to Los Angeles so I could be near her.
And in terms of, getting into the movie poster industry then, what was the turning point for that?
Well, it was interesting. I needed money. I had postponed my student loan payments, and I could only have them be on forbearance for so long. And when I came back to Los Angeles, I just needed any type of job. And one of my friends back in college, she told me that there was an opening for a receptionist at her movie poster advertising agency. And, at that point I was like, okay, any job will do. I just need to make money. And I remember coming in for my interview, but at that same time, I also had an illustration in Spin magazine. And, during my interview, I showed him my illustration. And, one of the owners of that company, he was a painter himself. And he said, what are you doing answering phones? You can paint and draw. And I was like, well, I need money. And he's like, you know what? You're not going to answer phone. I'm going to try you out as a junior designer. And that's where my life completely changed. I started, they had me kind of on a trial period, and I had never used a computer other than writing emails at that point. And I had no idea what it took to make a movie poster. I think anybody from the outside looking in will be like, well, how hard is it? But once you're in the trenches, you really see how hard it is to push out something you are proud of that meets the marketing, that ticks all the boxes of marketing. And so, I learned on the job, and I was so thankful that during that time I had so many patient people around me, because I should have been fired day one.
But you had to learn what it took, didn't you, to convince the creative directors or the ad agencies that you were working with? There are various ways to get into this. Talk about a few of them and what it really does take. That kind of persistence, for sure, that you clearly had.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I took working there the same way that I kind of treated going to art center. I figured I had a lot to learn, and I figured I had to catch up. So every night I was there till midnight. I remember the cleaning crew of the agency and we formed a bond because we were often there every night by ourselves. But I really wanted to learn. I really wanted to figure out how to do this. And so I had to teach myself Photoshop. I had to teach myself how to work with typography, which I never really paid attention to before then. And although I always kind of had ideas, I didn't realize how much editorial illustration was such a strength, because it's the same exercise of distilling a story into one image. So that became extremely helpful. But also when I started in the movie poster industry, there wasn't very much illustration in posters. It was a lot of Photoshop heads, a lot of just showing the actor as big as possible, or explosions and big epic scenes. So it really was a different language for me. And I had to kind of be thrown into the fire to learn it, because in addition to all the technical parts of building a movie poster, you also have to understand the language of every single genre. So, it took, it happened over time, but again, I attribute it to having amazing creative directors and having even amazing designers that were working alongside just next to me, where I could ask them questions or see what they were doing. So it in a way, it became another school for me.
What were your tools at that time then? You mentioned the computer, the software that you had to learn. Well, but prior to that, what were you using?
So what I was using before that I was just painting and scanning it in for all my freelance editorial assignments. So I had very minimal Photoshop knowledge. And so starting in that agency, I really had to learn how to put things together in Photoshop and make them feel seamless. A lot of my photographic work that you may see on my website, if people think that I was lazy enough to just crop a shot, that means that I was able to use witchcraft and Photoshop to make you think that. Because quite often there are so many movie poster ad agencies competing for the same poster. So the only way to bring something different is to add an idea or form these scenes that don't exist. So you really have this sleight of hand trick where you're doing so much doctoring and you don't want it to be noticed. So I really learned so much using Photoshop, and that slowly also went back to my more analog work, where, techniques I would teach myself in Photoshop, I would then apply to how I painted something by hand. And when I first started in this agency, I had a very specific look of illustration that I applied and always did for all my editorial work. But I knew that going in, the longer I stayed at this agency, I knew that would kind of only be appropriate for independent films. And that if I wanted to have illustration be accepted for other genres, I was definitely going to have to switch it up. And, especially time specific, era, like periodic pieces, you can't just do the same thing for every movie. You really have to pay attention to visual cues that make sense for the time period or even just the tone of the film. So, when I was in art school, they teach you just have one look because this is what's going to distinguish you from other artists. I really had to switch it up when it came to movie posters because I wanted to work on all types of projects, not just art house film.
And develop, obviously, the eye you have, but the style that you've created, which is clearly unique to you now. And then there were different ways of working in this industry, aren't there? You mentioned the ad agencies that and then you're also working directly with the studios as well and the directors.
Yes, and that started happening more recently. I was at 2 different agencies full time, but then I became freelance. And when I was freelance, I was still being hired by movie poster ad agencies as one of the designers to put together a presentation. But then slowly over time, studios started contacting me directly.
And in terms of developing this style now, do you think you could describe it and characterize it if you had to do an elevator pitch?
Oh boy. I mean, it's so hard because it's something that you don't see that connects them. And I think it's conceptual. I focus so much on concept, and the concept determines how I paint the piece because I feel like it's so important that they go hand in hand. A lot of my ideas for optical illusions, they would not be possible if I had to paint them realistically. So in addition to coming up with that core concept, I also have to come up with a way to paint it that best complements the concept. And that's where my role as an art director comes in. I think often people think of illustrators as someone that just are more like paint by numbers, or somebody else is telling them what to paint and how to paint it. But for me, it's so important that I come up with the concept because that completely determines how it's going to be executed.
And I think I read somewhere that Funny Games was the poster that actually launched your movie poster career.
It definitely did. I had no idea that it would make such huge waves.
What did you learn from that?
Well, I mean, originally we were supposed to get a high resolution screen grab from the film. And so I was making this poster in addition to maybe 6 others. And there were other designers making tons and tons of other posters for a presentation. And my illustration was just supposed to be kind of a placeholder for when eventually we get the high resolution image. But the director actually fell in love with the illustration. And, how we work in movie poster ad agency is that so much is created for one round, and then slowly the client narrows it down and it goes through multiple rounds until finally one is picked in the end. But for that one poster to be picked, there are thousands created before that. So to see that my illustration kept making it to other rounds, it was so exciting, and I really didn't think it stood a chance in hell. And then slowly over time, it was really dwindling down to that. And I remember that it was Warner Independent. They didn't feel that a teardrop was enough. They wanted to add blood on her face, or a glove grabbing her hair, or create a scene. And even though I was still a young designer, I felt so strongly that it needed to be kept as is. And so luckily, my creative director at that time, he was behind me and he was pushing for keeping it simple. The studio kept pushing back, and I actually got to the point where I was like, look, if we're going to have to add all this crap, I don't want my name on it. Like, give it to somebody else. And luckily, the director was behind keeping it true to what it was. And that became the actual poster. And I am so thankful that that happened, because at that point I started getting a lot of indie jobs. I got a lot of like horror jobs, and it slowly just, it gave me more of a voice after it was appreciated. And I was really happy about that.
How do you cope with the competitiveness of the industry?
I cope with it very simply. I get paid whether my stuff gets picked or not. So it's never like a pitch where I'm making all this work, and if they don't use it, I don't get paid. So that softens the blow. But I think I learned very, very early on that you have to have thick skin for this industry. And even if you feel like yours is like the best poster you've ever created, it may not work for whatever the studio is trying to market. So it does come down to some weird abstract math that has to do with marketing. So as long as you know that, you can't take it personally. And I think what has softened the blow even more recently is having Instagram and being able to show pieces that were cut. You know, so like, I don't feel like they're complete loss. People still get to appreciate them. And, you know, after working in this industry for almost 20 years now, if one of my pieces doesn't make it to the finish line, I could still use the core concept of that. I mean, of course, I never recycle artwork, but if there's a concept behind it that could work for something else, you know, it's not completely lost.
They don't have exclusive rights on the concept.
No, they don't.
Well, there are so many of your posters I could pick out. There's one that is a favorite, and that is Portrait of a Lady on Fire, because I think that really made me pay attention to your work. And I think I heard an interview with you on NPR, and I'm one of many that did not see the kiss in the first time I looked at it. So how did you come up with that? Well, tell me the story of that. I'd be fascinated as to how, you know, where were you approached? Was that through an agency or directly with Celine Sciamma, the director?
This was directly with the movie studio Neon.
Neon. Mm-hmm.
And I was really lucky because they already had a main photographic poster in the works.
Right.
So that immediately takes the pressure off of me. And because my poster was going to be a secondary poster, I knew that we could take more risks. And so it's funny because like usually when I come to a studio and I kind of like, okay, here are my concepts for it. I usually put my favorite concept at the very front. And sometimes it works. Most of the time it doesn't. But in this case, Neon took the bait. And I was so happy that they wanted to go for something so simple. And, you know, of course, when I pitched the idea, it was just a simple flame. But the more I thought about it and the more I was thinking about the story of the film and how she's an oil painter, I was like, well, it has to be oil paint, you know? And so I painted this on board using acrylic, but acrylic just doesn't give the same look as oil. And I really wanted to feel textural and three-dimensional, so you really feel it. And it almost gives it this energy too. And I think that really made it come to life. So I scanned in my acrylic version of it, and then using stock photography, I was finding these paint daubs. And I was here constructing it so that they fit the curve of the brush, and, you know, I was changing the colors and everything. So that was definitely a mix of both digital and analog. And it kind of took a life of its own as I made it. You know, I mean, we had the concept locked, but it was actually working on it that it became more and more solidified, and became what it was. And so I was so happy that Neon let me do that. And, you know, I think the hidden kiss, I mean, we've seen that a million times. We've seen that as like probably the number one optical illusion that we think of is like the candle holder and the two profiles. So I was actually surprised that it got so much attention that it did, because I was like, oh, it's little, it's been done before, but never in this way. But to think that people actually loved the poster without even seeing the kiss, I think that was really great, and as I mentioned earlier, to get something through that's so simple is a huge feat. It's such a thing to be proud of, and to have people love the poster, not knowing about the optical illusion, was like, it felt great. And to later on tell people about it and then have them go, oh my God, how did I not see it? And now that's all I can see. I love creating imagery that forces people to come back and take a look at it and discover something new.
Yeah, you really make people think about what they're looking at.
Yeah. Like anytime I can use optical illusions in my work, I try always.
I think you probably stand back and, have a rock star moment when you do, huh?
You know what? I'm usually so like buried under deadlines that I don't even have a chance to really let it soak in. And like, I think, even with like posting it on Instagram, there's always this moment, and it's the same with clients, where you send a piece and you're holding your breath because you're like, they're either going to love it or they're going to fire me. And so this was one of those pieces. So I was like so happy that we got something so simple through as a poster, but I had no idea the amount of like attention this poster would grab. So I'm so thankful for it.
I'm wondering if it's impossible for you to have any favorites.
If I had to think about favorites of my pieces, it changes, and it changes all the time. And sometimes it's not about the piece. Sometimes it's the process. But I'm thankful that Funny Games gave me the career that it did. And I'm thankful for how simple and bold Portrait of a Lady on Fire was. And so I think those two are definitely like my heavy hitters. I think people also seem to really love Dune. And that was fun because I'd never really done something like that. And it was a learning process along the way. And so, every new project I get, I don't want to repeat myself. I mean, there are times when a client says, let's repeat yourself. And I'm like, oh, but for the most part, when I'm given a chance to really kind of step out of how I normally do things, I'm so excited for that. And especially when it works.
Well, another favorite of mine is Tar. That must have been enormously satisfying because I thought they were brilliant, but they were just brilliant.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
They really were. I'm wondering how you came up with that concept, though, the one of her lying down.
Originally, when I was presenting ideas, one of them was more where she was standing up and she was almost being crucified. And instead of the stakes, it was going to be the conductor's wand, the conductor's baton. And then that slowly, somehow over time, morphed into her being on the ground, pinned down, which slowly then transformed into this like Gulliver's Travels type illustration. And when me and Focus Features came up with and Todd as well came up with like, it was kind of it kind of morphed into this Gulliver's Travel type setup. And then once that idea was like, okay, this is what we're doing, I was like, okay, I should reference that stream of concept by an illustration style. And that's when I wanted this kind of storybook feeling. And that's when I took heavy notes of like where it kind of fades away at the edges, and I really wanted to, it was almost like ironic that we have this like storybook, like fantasy for like a very heavy and dark film. So I was really happy when Focus Feature let me do that. And as far as the other piece with the crumpled head, that was so close to being a finish as well. And at the last minute, it didn't make it to the end. But again, I was just so happy to make that piece and to make two painted pieces for it.
As you say, you can always show the ones that don't get through. You will always be able to show them now thanks to social media. But also, I should mention the book that you published a couple of years ago.
Yes.
Yeah, Akiko-matic, the work of Akiko Stehrenberger. Is there other books in the work? I can imagine this would only represent, obviously, those that it could at the time.
Yeah.
Is this going to be something you'll do again?
Well, so when we sent that book off to the publishers, to get published, just a few months later, Portrait of a Lady on Fire was released. And then after that, a few months later, Dune and so many other pieces, and I was like, oh, I knew that was going to happen. It's like someone shooting a documentary, and as soon as they wrap, there's like some huge life-changing situations. So I was really happy that, that Hatton Beard, the publisher, they came back to me and they're like, we have to do a second edition. So the second edition, which is going to be coming out in fall, they're taking pre-orders now, it's going to have so much new work. And I think starting from 2019 on, we're going to have quite a bit of new work for this one. I would say at least a third of the book will be new work.
Fabulous.
And I'm hoping that as soon as that's published, I don't have like my next huge thing. But I guess that's a good problem to have, right?
Yeah, a great problem to have. But I should mention the most recent one I saw of New Life from the director John Rosman that you posted on social media. And he said some very nice things about you, that Akiko is simply one of the best poster artists of all time. And she's also an extraordinary meme lord. How does that land with you? Do you realize the impact that you're having?
I mean, those are very, very sweet words from John. That's so kind. And, the thing that I got the kick out of the most from that excerpt is the meme lord.
Did he come up with that? I haven't heard of being a meme lord before. Good for him.
He did. I mean, I had never heard that before, but yeah, I laughed out loud because he actually screenshotted it and circled it and then texted it to me. And that's when I reposted it. Cause I was like, like I mentioned earlier, I love getting pats on the back from people I respect, about my memes. But yeah, I mean, those are kind words. And I'm honored that he says that about my work. I don't know if I'm the greatest of all time. That was definitely really sweet. But I think there's so many amazing designers, and I think just more recently we're starting to see more and more of that because of streaming services and studios wanting to take more chances in their advertising. We're seeing more creative work. That creative work was always there, but a lot of it never got to see the light of day. So even though I feel so honored that he's giving me that title, I know that there is so much amazing work that is out there. And there are so many times I'm looking on Instagram at other people's work and I'm like, oh my God, oh, I love it. I love it. Oh, I wish I would have done something like that, and so I'm constantly influenced by my peers, and I'm constantly so humbled by such great work, and it's only going to get better. That's what I believe.
Are we seeing more women in the industry?
Definitely. I think, there were always like a good amount of women at a lot of the agencies that I would freelance for, but because they are full-time at agencies, the agency gets the credit, not them personally. And I think, unless they decide to become freelancers, we're not going to see their names attached to some of the work. But I do know a good amount of female designers that are quite incredible.
But life is good for you now then. No more loans?
No more loans. I have on my wall, some people have put up their degree. But I have framed on my wall a letter from my student loans telling me that I paid off my student loan.
Very satisfying. That is huge.
It's huge. My biggest accomplishment other than having my son.
And I understand you obviously you're a full-time mom, so you're working 5 days a week. And you make time for parenting. Well,
I co-parent him, because I'm no longer together with his father. So we cut the week in half with him. So, the half week that I have with him, I try to balance it with work. then when he goes back to his father's house, I am working feverishly because I want to be able to enjoy my time with him. He's 6. And every time he comes from his dad's house, I swear to God, he's grown another inch. So I'm very aware of how little time I have where he wants to actually hang out with me. So I have to manage my schedule quite strategically so that I can be there for this time.
Has he got to the point where he's looking over your shoulder when you're working at all? Does he realize what you do?
He does here and there. I mean, I don't talk about it too much, but I have had a few art exhibitions that he's been to, and I think he's slowly starting to understand that this is how mom pays for all of his toys.
We're looking back now as we wrap up, Akiko. What would you like your legacy to be?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, if anything, just pushing for leaving behind a push for unconventional work and opening the door for more of it, whether it comes from me or from other designers. Because, I do feel like there is so much art in movie poster making that people aren't aware of. And the more that we designers are able to express that and show it off, like, it's just only going to keep it coming. It's only going to encourage more. And so I'm really excited to see what happens over the years with movie poster advertising.
Do you recoil at the thought of AI?
I don't. I mean, I might be naive, but I really think that I feel like for certain jobs, it's definitely going to be an issue. But I think for people that are heavily conceptual and wanting to not be afraid of new media, but embrace it and find a new way to work with it, I'm excited to see what happens over the hump. I think right now everybody's freaked out, but I think everybody was freaked out when Photoshop came into the mix. So if people can utilize it and really make something interesting come out of it, where it doesn't have to be such a replacement of something, I feel like that's possible. So talk to me in 6 months when I'm out of a job. but I'm not letting fear get to me about AI. At least not for my job. I know in other careers it can be very scary.
Well, I look forward to many, many more film posters, Akiko, and also to your Instagram stories, of course, stuff in my day.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much for taking time. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Likewise. It's a pleasure speaking with you. So thank you.
You'll find a link to Akiko's social media and her website in the show notes accompanying this episode. And I do recommend you follow her on Instagram. If you have a moment while you're listening to this podcast, do leave us a review and 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, because that boosts our ranking and helps others find the show. If you'd like to reach us on social media, we're at the AART Podcast on Instagram. That's AART. And you can also drop us a line to hollowellstudios@gmail.com if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening. I'll be back next week, so I hope you'll join me then.